Species separation. When the species separates, it really increases the likelihood and the speed of evolution. It really kind of pushes it right along. Um, Before we do that, what is a species, and what does the separation have to do with? Surprisingly enough, species, the idea of a species and the idea of separating species and evolution and natural stuff, a lot of it has to do with reproduction. The entire definition of species has to do with that can mate and produce fertile offspring. What that means is it's a group that can mate, reproduce. And when they do mate, they not only produce babies, but the babies they produce are able to produce their own babies in the future. So sometimes you have organisms that can mate and there is a child born, but the child is sterile. In other words, it will never have children. So that it's almost like it's nature's way of ending it right there. We don't want you to go any further. One example of this is the horse, the donkey, and the mule. A horse and a donkey are really not the same species. They really would never mate naturally. Humans force that to happen or cause it to happen. And when they do, the child that is born is called a mule. It's a little bit stronger than a donkey, but it's a little bit more agile than a horse. And a lot of times humans were using that for the farms. The thing is, the mule cannot have babies of its own, ever. No mule ever in the world has or will ever be able to reproduce. It's kind of like nature's doesn't really like the mule. Yeah, I think we'll stop right about there. Anyway, so what we're talking about for this situation is separating species, and it has a lot to do with reproduction. Okay, so reproduction rates in a species can strongly influence whether evolution does or does not take place. One, sometimes the species will not be reproducing because they just can't mate. And sometimes the species won't be reproducing because they just won't mate. Not doing it. Can't make me. So what's the difference? Can't mate. We're talking about anatomically or physically. So anatomically is referring to their bodies. Their bodies may just physically not be able to mate. There are some dogs that are bred, but they cannot reproduce on their own. They have to have humans to help them. In nature, they would not exist. Or maybe two similar species you would think look a lot alike and could be a lot alike, have their DNA is just so different that when they come together and mate, then chromosomes don't match up. You have to have the same number of chromosomes in the father and the mother to produce an offspring. So if you don't have that, they're not going to make any babies. More importantly, if two species or two members of the same species are in totally different locations, how are they going to mate? There's no way it's physically possible for any reproduction to happen. So there's also the location is obviously part of the reason why they cannot mate. Sometimes they just won't mate. After evolution starts happening for a while or natural selection takes a little turn, sometimes even though you were from the same family, the groups start to look a little different. We know that again in human race, we have lots of different cultures. Well, maybe after a while they look different enough that they don't want to mate with each other. You should have learned about this when you read about the finches. The finches were a species of birds that lived on the Galapagos Island. And they originally was just one bird, and then that one bird over millions of years kind of evolved into lots of different birds. Well, some of the reasons why that evolution kind of got pushed forward was that they were competing for food. They all ate the same food originally. But once some birds started being able to eat different foods, they began to live in different places. Some stayed in the trees where the food was. Some stayed on the ground where the other food was. And if the ones living on the ground and the ones living in the trees never met each other, never hung out, then they would eventually stop mating. If you stop mating, that DNA is just going to stay that DNA, and all your babies are going to look just like you, and all your babies are going to look just like you, and you are now going to be a separate species. That was one thing that happened to them. But some other cases is they came back together again. And after so many years, if this bird and this bird were to meet, do you think they would mate with each other? Think they would even think they were related? Probably not. Now, the technical names for that, if you did the assignments, are geographic and reproductive isolation. We got two types of bears here, living in two different types of environments. Oh, the polar bear and the black bear. Now, originally, the polar bear and the black bear, or genetically, the polar bear and the black bear really are still considered the same species each other. Their DNA has changed a bit, enough to maybe separate them. But in reality, they can mate with each other. They just are not mating with each other. Can anyone think of the reason why? Oh, good, you got it. This would be a geographic isolation example because one is way up here in the north and one is, in the woods, and they are never crossing each other's paths. They do believe that this species was once had a common ancestor that they were both related to, and they did have a large bear migration. Some bears went one way and some bears went another way, and they just kept walking till they found food. The bears that settled up in the north, born white, survived, and the ones that were born dark didn't. The ones that headed more south and towards the woods, they were able to survive if they were born dark, and they were not able to survive if they were born white. And that's pretty much how it goes. But we wouldn't have a black bear and a polar bear, very different bears, if they hadn't been separated. Of course, that was until now. Dun, 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 dun. There is a big situation going on up there in those polar regions with all this global warming. The polar bears are really struggling. They are endangered, very much endangered, and facing extinction. So in their last hours of need, they are looking for food, and they are looking for mates, and they are migrating once again. And it has been said that these two have been coming in contact with each other. Enter the gorilla bear. It turns out that there is a possible brand new species, and it's happening right now before our eyes. Evolution is starting to take place. Go ahead, I'm going to have you read all about it. But these growler bears, being a mixture of the two, there's a couple of traits that are a little problematic. But coloring wise, in the growler bears, you can see both patterns of color and similarities, but yet they're showing both versions of the parent's DNA, causing a brand new species. So you're going to read about this now. Growler.